At 2:17 in the morning, a backcountry ranger heard footsteps walking across his porch, but when he looked outside, there was no one there. Then, one by one, wet, barefoot footprints began appearing on the dry wooden boards directly in front of his door. He couldn't see a person, couldn't reach anyone on the radio, and had no idea who was watching him from the darkness beyond the trees. What he discovered after sunrise made the footprints look less like a threat and more like a distraction. Because someone had been studying the cabin long before that night, and the footprints were only meant to keep him looking in one direction. And once he realized where the person had actually gone, the strange night on the porch became the least disturbing part of the story. The footsteps were already on the porch when I opened my eyes, and for several seconds I stayed completely still because I couldn't place the sound in the cabin. They were soft, not the hard heel-to-toe weight of a boot, and they moved slowly across the wooden boards outside my bunk room window. One step, a pause, another step, then three in quick succession toward the front door. I checked my watch. 2:17 in the morning. The propane heater had clicked off sometime earlier, and without it the cabin had that particular high country cold where the floorboards feel almost damp under your socks. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and then stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. I was 38 that summer, working my 4th season for the Forest Service, and most of my job at that station involved things that sounded much less interesting than what people imagine when they heard backcountry ranger. Trail reports, permit checks, drainage work, radio logs, checking bear-resistant storage, making sure hikers hadn't moved closure signs because they wanted an easier route. The cabin sat above 8,000 feet on the edge of a large wilderness district in the northern Cascades, 6 miles from the nearest maintained road and another hour beyond that from the district office. There was a small meadow behind it, a maintenance shed, a spring box, and a narrow trail that climbed another 1,000 feet toward an old fire lookout that had been closed to the public for years. We had one VHF radio, one weather receiver, a solar panel that charged a battery bank, and a landline that had been disconnected before I arrived that season. Most nights, once the last light disappeared behind the ridge, there wasn't much to hear except wind and animals. So when I heard the footsteps again, directly outside the front room, I knew they weren't coming from a bear. Bears don't walk that lightly, and they don't stop at a door as if they're deciding whether to knock. I slid out of bed, put on my boots without tying them, and moved down the narrow hallway. The cabin was an old Forest Service patrol structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a radio desk, and a covered porch that wrapped around the south side. I kept the interior lights off. Moonlight came through the kitchen window in a pale rectangle. The footsteps came once more. 2 slow steps, a longer pause. Then something touched the porch railing. I could hear the wood give a faint tick under pressure. I stood beside the front window and looked for the gap in the curtain. Nothing. The porch boards were dry. The gravel beyond them was pale under the moon. The nearest trees began 20 yards away, mostly subalpine fir and mountain hemlock, their branches moving slightly in the wind. I waited another minute, then another. Nothing moved. I checked the door latch, still locked. I remember thinking that if somebody had hiked up there in the middle of the night, they had made a poor choice. The temperature had dropped below freezing, the trail was steep, and the nearest vehicle access was miles away. I also remember thinking about something I had noticed earlier that evening. One of the old trail signs near the meadow had been turned around. It was pointing downhill when it should have pointed toward the cabin. I had assumed a hiker had leaned against it. That assumption bothered me later. At 2:31, I wrote a short note in the station log, mostly because that was what we were supposed to do with unusual activity. Heard footsteps on porch, no contact. Checked exterior from window, no person observed. I underlined the time, then I went back to bed. I didn't sleep. Around 3:05, I heard a faint scraping sound under the porch. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. I thought of the bear-resistant food locker, which sat against the east wall, and wondered if a raccoon had somehow reached that elevation. Then I heard a single step on the porch, I sat up. Another. This time the sound was different. There was a slight wet slap to it. Not loud, barely more than the sound of a hand pressing against wet pavement. I got up again and checked the front window. The porch was still empty, but when I opened the deck, or a few inches, cold air came through, carrying the smell of wet soil. I looked down. The boards directly in front of the threshold were dry. 3 feet farther out, there was one dark mark. I crouched and touched it with a gloved finger. Water. I opened the door another few inches and looked across the porch. Nothing. The rest of the boards were dry except for a second mark near the railing. It was shaped roughly like the front half of a bare human foot. I didn't like that. Not because it was mysterious, because it was practical. If somebody was walking around outside barefoot at 2:30 in the morning at 8,000 feet, they were either in trouble or doing something deliberately. I took my radio and tried the district frequency. Static. I switched to the repeater channel. More static. I checked the battery indicator. Full. The weather receiver was working, so the power system wasn't the problem. The repeater itself was probably blocked by the ridge, which happened occasionally during certain weather conditions, but I could usually catch a weak signal if I walked 50 yards uphill. I didn't want to walk uphill in the dark toward an unknown person. That was one of those moments when procedure and instinct pull in opposite directions. Procedure said, investigate. Instinct said, keep the door locked and wait for daylight. I chose the second one. At 3:19, I heard another wet step, then another. They moved from the far end of the porch toward the door, but something about the rhythm was wrong. The spaces between the prints were inconsistent. I opened the curtain slightly. The moon had disappeared behind clouds, and the porch was almost black. I couldn't see a person. I could see the ground beyond the railing, though, and that was where the next strange detail appeared. A flashlight beam swept through the trees, not toward the cabin, across the meadow. Once, then it disappeared. About 30 seconds later it came back, lower this time, moving between the trunks. I counted 3 sweeps before it vanished completely. I considered calling out, but didn't. A ranger station isn't a police station, and the people who work remote patrol cabins are trained to avoid escalating unknown encounters when there is no immediate emergency. I wrote another line in the log. Possible light movement meadow, east side. No radio contact. At 4:02 the weather changed. Wind came down from the ridge and pushed a bank of mist through the trees. It arrived quickly, filling the meadow until the cabin seemed to sit on a small island of dry ground. That was when the footprints began appearing where I could actually watch them happen. I was standing at the kitchen window when I saw a dark shape form on the porch board outside. There was no visible foot, no person, just a wet impression appearing as if someone had stepped there. Then another impression formed about 14 inches ahead of it. I backed away from the window so fast I hit the counter. The second print was unmistakable. 5 toes, heel narrowed. The kind of impression you get when a wet bare foot comes down hard enough to leave its shape. Then a third appeared. It was angled slightly toward the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and swept the beam across the porch. Empty. The prints stopped. I opened the door and found 5 of them. They started near the railing and led toward the entrance. There were no corresponding tracks beyond the first one. I crouched and studied them. The boards were dry around each print. That mattered. It meant whoever had made them hadn't simply walked through mud and then crossed the porch. The moisture was localized. I looked over the railing. The ground below was wet from the mist, but there was no obvious path leading up to the porch. Then I noticed something else. The prints weren't all facing the same direction. The first 2 pointed toward the door. The third was almost sideways. The fourth pointed away. The fifth overlapped the edge of the fourth, as though someone had deliberately placed a foot into an existing impression. I knew what that meant, because I had spent enough time studying tracks to know when tracks weren't natural. Someone had been stepping backward into their own footprints. I went back inside and locked the door. By then it was 4:30, and I had maybe 90 minutes before first light. I decided I would not leave the cabin until then. I also started looking at the prints as a problem instead of a threat. That helped. Rangers do that. You turn a frightening thing into measurements. The prints were approximately 11 inches long. The distance between the first and second was 14 inches. The second and third were 21. The third and fourth were only 6. There were no shoe impressions, no bicycle marks, no drag marks, no animal tracks. I photographed them through the doorway and recorded the direction. Then, while I was checking the photos, I noticed a shadow crossing the porch. It came from the side of the cabin, stretched by my flashlight, and for a second, it looked like an animal with 4 legs standing beside me. I turned immediately. Nothing. I shut the flashlight off. The shadow disappeared. I turned it back on. It was just the edge of the porch railing and the coil of hose hanging from a nail. I almost laughed at myself. Almost. Then I noticed that the hose had been moved. It normally hung beneath the kitchen window. Now it was beside the front door. I had not moved it. That bothered me more than the footprints. The hose was old, stiff rubber, and the hook had been bent outward enough that it could only have come loose if someone had pulled it. At 5:06, the mist began lifting. I could see the meadow again. There was a single line of footprints leading away from the cabin, but they were strange in a different way. They appeared to be boot tracks at first. I followed them with my eyes toward the tree line. Then I realized the pattern was wrong. The tracks traveled 10 or 12 feet, disappeared, and then resumed farther left. Between those sections there were no impressions at all. Whoever had made them had either walked on rocks or carried something. I wasn't going to find out which. At 5:22, the repeater finally came alive. I heard a burst of static, then a voice from the district office asking for a morning check-in. I transmitted my call sign. The dispatcher answered. I told her I had possible nighttime trespass activity and requested another ranger come up when the road crew was available. She asked whether I had seen anyone. I said no. She asked whether I needed emergency assistance. I said no, not at that point. That wording mattered. I didn't want to send somebody blindly into the dark because of footprints. At 6:10, daylight was strong enough for me to walk the perimeter. I found the source of the wet footprints, or what I thought was the source. Behind the cabin, near the spring box, there was a small plastic storage tub filled with water. It was normally kept inside the maintenance shed. Someone had carried it outside and placed it behind the cabin. There were wet marks on the grass leading toward the porch, but they stopped several feet short. The rest of the path was covered by flattened grass rather than footprints. I found a length of thin rope attached to the porch railing. It disappeared into the misty grass and ended at the storage tub. That was the trick. Someone had been able to pull the tub from a distance and use it to wet individual boards, probably by swinging or dragging the rope while staying out of sight. The barefoot impressions were likely made with a simple mold or a cut piece of rubber pressed onto the boards. The fact that they appeared one at a time suggested somebody had been standing in the trees watching the cabin and controlling when I saw them. It was childish almost, but it was also deliberate. I checked the maintenance shed next. The padlock was intact. Inside, nothing obvious was missing. Then, I noticed the old survey map pinned to the wall. A section of trail near the closed lookout had been marked in pencil. I hadn't done it. The line showed an old service route that had been decommissioned 12 years earlier. I knew that route because I had found it during training, but it wasn't on the current public map. The pencil mark continued directly to the back of my cabin. That was the point where the incident stopped feeling like somebody messing with a ranger for entertainment. Someone had been studying the station, maybe for days, maybe longer. At 7:40, another ranger arrived from the lower station, and we walked the old service route together. About half a mile in, we found fresh boot prints under the trees, along with a flattened place where someone had been sitting. There was an empty coffee cup, still damp inside, and a cheap pair of binoculars wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. No identification, no weapon, nothing that gave us a name. The boot prints led uphill and turned back toward the road. We followed them until they reached an area of exposed granite, where the trail disappeared. We never found the person. The official report eventually described the incident as Probable unauthorized overnight presence associated with deliberate disturbance of station property. That was accurate, as far as it went. What it didn't mention was the last thing I saw before leaving the cabin that afternoon. I was packing my gear when sunlight came through the west window and cast my shadow across the floor. I noticed that one arm looked longer than the other because the flashlight was hanging from my pack strap. Completely ordinary. I knew why it looked that way, but for some reason I couldn't stop staring at it. The previous night, in the dark, I had seen a four-legged shape where there was only a railing and a hose. Now my own shadow looked unfamiliar, slightly wrong, and my brain kept trying to correct it, even though there was nothing to correct. I moved the flashlight. The shadow changed. I moved again. It followed. Of course it did. I still check shadows now when I'm outside after dark. Not because I think they move on their own. It's worse in a way. I know exactly how easy it is for a familiar shape to become unfamiliar when you're tired, isolated, and waiting for somebody you cannot see. The part I never managed to explain was why the person who made those footprints chose a method that depended on me looking directly at them. They didn't need me frightened. They needed me watching the porch. And while I was doing that, someone had already walked away from the cabin along the old route, carrying my attention with them. By the time I realized the truck had been following the wrong road, I was already too far from the contact station to turn around without making this situation worse. I was 46 that year, which meant I had spent enough seasons in the desert to develop an annoying habit of noticing tires before I noticed faces. A vehicle parked where it shouldn't be, fresh dust on a gate chain, a second set of tracks beside an authorized service road. Those things usually told me more than somebody's story did. I was working a temporary ranger assignment in a remote BLM district in southern Utah, covering a desert contact station that normally had 2 people during the busy months, but had been running short because of staffing changes. The station sat beside a rough-graded road several miles from the nearest paved highway. There was a small office, a radio mast, a maintenance shed, 2 steel water tanks, and a gravel pullout where visitors occasionally stopped to ask about the canyon routes. In late September, the days were still hot, but the nights could drop hard enough that you wanted a jacket by sunset. The incident started with a mistake that belonged to me. At 4:40 in the afternoon, I saw a white utility pickup turn through the closed gate on the East Service Road. The gate was supposed to remain locked until a trail crew came through the following morning. I wrote down the license plate from memory and got into my government truck. The pickup was already several hundred yards ahead of me, throwing a pale ribbon of dust through the cottonwoods. I called the station on the VHF. Nothing came back. I tried the district repeater. Static. I knew that dead zone. The canyon walls blocked the repeater from that side, and I should have turned around and used the satellite phone. Instead, I followed. That was the first decision I would later wish I could take back. The service road narrowed after about 2 miles and crossed a dry wash. I expected the utility pickup to stop at the old maintenance compound, but it continued beyond it. I slowed down. The road ahead was little more than 2 tire grooves through hard-packed clay. The pickup disappeared around a bend. I followed another 100 yards and stopped. There was no vehicle, no dust, no engine noise. I got out and listened. Desert silence isn't actually silent. There were ravens somewhere above the ridge, wind rubbing against dry grass, the faint ticking of my truck engine cooling, but no vehicle. I walked forward and found fresh tire tracks continuing around the bend. I was laughing at that moment all live. Then I saw a second set beside them, narrower, passenger car, maybe. They hadn't been there on my drive-in that morning. I looked back toward my truck. I had the sudden, unpleasant feeling that I had driven farther than I remembered. It was probably just the road. Heat and distance distort things in that country. Still, I went back. When I reached the truck, the driver's door was open. I knew I had closed it. The radio handset was hanging outside the cab. I picked it up and checked the cord. No damage. My clipboard was on the passenger seat. but the map I had been using was gone. That was when the practical part of my brain took over. I checked the truck, found nothing missing, and drove back toward the station. I did not see the white pickup again. At 5:28, I reached the contact station and locked the gate behind me. I made coffee, logged the vehicle incident, and wrote down everything I could remember before my memory had a chance to smooth over the details. White utility pickup, no agency markings, plate ending in 472 or possibly 427. Male driver not observed. Second tire set. Map missing. I underlined the uncertainty in the plate number because that mattered. I stepped outside to check the solar batteries and found a boot print beside the generator shed. It was sharply defined in the dust. Size 11, deep heel, lug pattern. I compared it with mine. Different. I checked around the building and found two more. They led toward the back window of the office and then stopped. No prints went toward the road. That bothered me. Someone had approached from the desert side. I went inside and shut the steel door. The radio remained useless. I tried the satellite phone. It powered on, displayed a low battery warning, and shut itself off. I had forgotten to charge it after the previous storm inspection. That was my second mistake. I had a backup, but it was locked in the maintenance shed because the charging cabinet inside the office had failed earlier that month. I decided to retrieve it before dark. The shed was 30 yards away. I took my flashlight, crossed the gravel, unlocked the padlock, and stepped inside. The backup phone was exactly where it should have been. What wasn't where it should have been was the old map board. Someone had moved it 6 inches to the left. That sounds ridiculous when I say it now. 6 inches. But the board was mounted on two screws and had been sitting in the same position for years. Behind it was a rectangular patch of cleaner metal where dust had not accumulated. There was nothing behind it except insulation and conduit. I put it back. On the way out, I noticed a faint smell of cigarette smoke. I don't smoke. The previous ranger didn't either. The station sat far enough from public roads that nobody should have been standing around smoking outside the shed. I walked back to the office without turning my flashlight toward the trees. At 7:13, somebody knocked on the station door. 3 taps. Not pounding, not urgent, just 3 firm knocks. I looked for the window and saw a man standing beside the porch. He was wearing a faded tan shirt, dark pants, and a baseball cap. He held both hands where I could see them. "You open?" he asked. I told him the station was closed for the evening. He nodded like that made sense. Then he asked if the road through the canyon was still open. I told him the eastern route was closed. He said, "That's not what I heard." I asked where he had come from. He pointed toward the road. I asked whether he was with the utility crew. He smiled briefly. "No, just looking around." There was something wrong with that answer, but not enough to justify anything more. I told him he needed to leave the restricted area. He looked past me into the office and said, "You got another person in there?" I said no. He nodded again. Then he asked whether the station radio was working. I didn't answer. He glanced at the antenna mast and walked away. I watched him until he disappeared behind the maintenance shed. I expected to hear a vehicle start. I didn't. 10 minutes later, I checked outside. His footprints crossed the gravel toward the east. They didn't continue past the shed. They simply stopped. I went back inside and locked the door. I know how that sounds, but there was no good reason for me to go looking for him in the dark. I wrote another entry in the incident log. This time I included his description. At 8:02, I heard a vehicle engine somewhere down in the canyon. It ran for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I killed the office lights and looked through the rear window. Far beyond the station, 2 headlights appeared between the cottonwoods. They didn't move toward me. They stayed fixed for several minutes. Then one went dark. The other shifted slightly to the left. I couldn't tell whether it was a vehicle turning or somebody carrying a light. I started thinking about the missing map. That map showed an old access route that wasn't on the public visitor maps. The route led around the canyon wall and ended near an abandoned survey structure. There was nothing valuable there now, but old structures sometimes attracted people who wanted privacy. I decided the next morning I would inspect it with another ranger. Until then, I stayed inside. Around 9:30, the wind picked up and pushed sand against the office windows. The temperature dropped quickly. I was sitting at the radio desk when the VHF suddenly came alive. A voice said my call sign. I reached for the microphone. "Go ahead, static." Then the voice repeated my call sign. I recognized it as my own voice. Not similar, mine. Same cadence, same clipped way I said the last syllable. I had recorded a station check earlier that afternoon, so for a few seconds I thought the radio had somehow replayed it. Then the voice said, "East Road clear." I had never transmitted those words. I unplugged the handset. The radio went silent. I checked the frequency manually. Nothing. I checked the recorder connected to the radio system. There was no incoming transmission logged. That left me with two possibilities, neither of which I liked. Someone had a recording of my voice, or somebody was deliberately imitating me over a frequency they knew I would monitor. At 10:15, I heard footsteps outside the office. They were boots this time. Slow, deliberate steps across gravel. I watched from the dark. A flashlight moved along the front wall, stopping briefly beneath the window. I could see a person standing just beyond the glass. I couldn't make out the face. Then the flashlight beam went out. I waited. Nothing. I checked a side window. Empty. The footsteps resumed, circling the building. They stopped at the rear door. The handle moved once. I had locked it. It moved again, harder, then stopped. I didn't call out. After several minutes, I heard the steps moving away. At 11:03, I finally used the backup satellite phone. I had managed to charge it from the truck inverter. The district dispatcher answered, and I gave her the situation as calmly as I could. She told me a county deputy would meet me at the main road in the morning. She also told me something I hadn't known. The white utility pickup I'd followed was not assigned to any agency in the area. A contractor had reported a similar vehicle stolen 3 weeks earlier. The description matched, including a dent on the rear driver's side. I told her about the man at the door. There was a pause. She asked me not to leave the station. I said I wasn't planning to. Then she asked whether I had moved the mat board in the maintenance shed. I said no. She said, "Don't touch it again." That sentence stayed with me. Around midnight, the wind died completely. The desert became unnaturally still. No insects, no birds, nothing. Then I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching from the east road. Headlights came through the trees. The vehicle stopped outside the gate. I could see a white pickup. It sat there for almost 5 minutes. Then the headlights turned off. A door opened, closed. I watched the gate. Nobody approached it. Then slowly, the pickup began reversing. It backed away down the road until the rear lights disappeared. I thought that was the end of it. At 1:17, I heard 3 knocks on the office door. The same pattern as before. I looked through the window. Nobody was there. But there was something on the porch. My missing map, folded neatly. I didn't touch it. I watched it for nearly an hour. At first, I thought the wind had blown it there. Then I noticed the paper wasn't dusty. It had been folded recently. At sunrise, the deputy arrived with another ranger. We searched the property and followed the vehicle tracks from the gate. They led toward the abandoned survey structure. We found the stolen utility pickup hidden behind a rock shelf. Nobody was inside. The truck had been used recently, and the rear compartment contained tools, fuel cans, a bolt cutter, and several printed copies of agency maps. The copies included a station and the old service route. We never found the man from the porch. The deputy believed he had been using the station as a reference point while moving equipment through the restricted area. That explanation made sense. What didn't make sense was the radio transmission. The district technicians later found no evidence that the repeater had been compromised, and the recording of my voice was never recovered. The incident was closed as unauthorized access connected to suspected theft. I returned to the station 2 weeks later to finish the season. The first thing I did was check the map board in the shed. It was still mounted correctly. The old pencil mark was gone. I hadn't erased it. Nobody admitted to doing it. I also found something inside the office that hadn't been there before. A small strip of yellow survey tape tucked beneath the edge of my logbook. I recognized the type. It was used by our own crews to mark routes temporarily. There was no reason for it to be inside the station. I threw it away. Years later, I learned that the stolen pickup had been recovered with a set of tires that matched the second track pattern I had seen on the service road. That part was ordinary enough. The thing I still think about happened much earlier. When I first followed the truck, I had written down its plate from a distance and believed I had made a mistake because I couldn't remember the last three numbers. When the deputy showed me the recovered vehicle's registration, the plate ended in 472. The number I had written down from memory was 472, but the license plate on the truck that was actually recovered ended in 427. I had been looking at the wrong number because, somehow, the vehicle I followed and the vehicle found the next morning were not the same truck. And when I checked my original field notebook after returning home, there was one line I had no memory of writing. It was beneath the vehicle description, in my own handwriting. Second truck arrived, before first one left.